Though credit should absolutely be given to Dana White and the UFC for consistently giving the fans the fights that matter when they matter, over the years there have still been a number of insanely good matchups that have slipped through the cracks. So, prepare yourself for a healthy dose of nostalgia and maybe even some frustration to go along with it as we dive into 10 tantalizing matchups that sadly never came to pass. Rafael dos Anjos vs. Conor McGregor. To kick things off, we turn our attention first to the 2016 super fight for the light heavyweight title that would have seen the newly crowned featherweight king Conor McGregor attempt to become the UFC's first dual-weight world champion. In his path was the fearsome 155-pound champ Rafael dos Anjos, a man who, at the time, was seen by many as potentially the single best lightweight fighter to ever lace up gloves. And he had the streak of form to show for it, besting Anthony Pettis, Donald Cerrone, Nate Diaz, and Benson Henderson to stamp his authority over the lightweight crop of hopefuls. With McGregor fresh off his 13-second knockout of the legendary Jose Aldo to win the featherweight strap, one could argue that momentum was never truly more on his side than at this point in time. Sadly, RDA was forced out of the matchup just 2 weeks out, leaving Nate Diaz as Conor's short-notice replacement opponent. Of course, we all know what happened next. Diaz defeated McGregor, dos Anjos lost his title to Eddie Alvarez, and though Conor would eventually achieve his two-weight world champion ambition, the showdown with RDA was unfortunately lost forever. Cain Velasquez vs. Jon Jones. We could honestly make an entire video based around the numerous fights Cain Velasquez never had the chance to compete in during his prime. As most of you will know, Velasquez's run through this sport was hindered massively by a string of persistent injuries, something that left him sidelined during what was supposed to be his charge towards greatness. As unfortunate as that was for him on a personal level, from the fans' perspective, Cain will now always be remembered as more of a what if than anything else, a truly great talent who could have been much greater. And though the 205-pound legend Jon Jones is only now truly set on making a move to heavyweight, there was a period of time during both of these guys' respective reigns that saw some serious buzz develop about a Velasquez versus Jones matchup. And it's hard to know just how far along the talks between those two in the UFC were, but there's no way not to lament the fact that these two never shared the octagon together. With Cain now seemingly retired from the sport after a disastrous return against the future champ Francis Ngannou, this is one fight that the MMA community have long since moved past, as sad as that might be. Fedor Emelianenko versus Brock Lesnar. Okay, so it might not have been the most competitive fight on this list, but how could we not give a mention to the 2009 matchup between the Pride legend Fedor Emelianenko and the pay-per-view king Brock Lesnar? Sure, this fight is completely bonkers and would have likely been won by Fedor with relative ease, but there was a period of time when Fedor was fresh out of a contract with the now defunct Affliction program where this fight was legitimately on the table. Dana White tried his utmost to bring the last emperor to the UFC, offering up an immediate title shot against the champion Lesnar and a lucrative contract in order to make the deal a reality. However, when Emelianenko's management demanded that the fight be a co-promotion between the UFC and M1 Global, Dana immediately shut down talks. It goes without saying that White has done a tremendous job at building the UFC into the powerhouse they are today, but even he will admit that one of his biggest failures over the years was failing to sign Fedor Emelianenko. Ronda Rousey vs. Chris Cyborg. Hindsight is 20/20. Of that, there is no doubt. But people are very quick to forget just how dominant and completely, utterly terrifying Ronda Rousey was during her peak years. Indeed, her fall from grace was ugly as hell. There's no other way to put it. But during that initial surge through the women's bantamweight division, there wasn't a more captivating fighter in the sport. With that said, even with Ronda's dominance in mind, the looming presence of the 145-pound powerhouse Chris Cyborg was a constant during Rousey's reign. If fighting Ronda was like falling into quicksand, taking on Cyborg was like jumping into the bullpen. These two women were seen as the two greatest female fighters of all time. And though they fought out of different promotions for the majority of their respective careers, the Cyborg question was constantly on the minds of the fans as they watched Rousey dispose of all comers within the UFC's 135-pound weight class. In the end, though Cyborg did eventually find her way to the bright lights of the UFC, Rousey's reign had long since come to an end. Both fighters would also eventually fall by the hand of the consensus GOAT, Amanda Nunes. An interesting note, of course, and something that only further proves the Lioness's merits as the all-time best. George St Pierre vs. Khabib Nurmagomedov. Next up, we have a more recent entry, the heavily rumored crossover bout between the greatest champion of the last era and perhaps the most dominant force of this one. Whether George St Pierre and Khabib Nurmagomedov actually made it to the negotiations table with the UFC or not is irrelevant. This fight was picking up some serious steam in the second half of 2020, something that was prompted by Khabib's apparent retirement from the sport. With Conor McGregor out of the picture, Nurmagomedov stressed that it would take a fighter of GSP's greatness to coax him back into competition. St Pierre, oddly enough, did seem to be interested in the fight, taking part in several interviews that saw him stir up some serious anticipation from the fans. However, as time moved on and his 40th birthday closing in, George officially retracted his interest in the matchup, accepting his retirement and leaving this bout with a fresh spot in the what-if pile. Khabib Nurmagomedov vs. Tony Ferguson. On 5 separate occasions, the UFC tried to make this era-defining matchup a reality. 5 times. If you didn't live through each instance of that slowly building excitement, followed by major frustration that this contest brought about, it truly will be difficult for you to fully understand. Khabib Nurmagomedov and Tony Ferguson were the 2 best lightweights of their era, fighting in perhaps the single greatest division in the sport's history. Khabib was undefeated, completely and utterly dominant, and at that point in time had never even lost a round. Ferguson, on the other hand, was dynamic, creative, and completely devastating, riding a 12-fight win streak that had seen him carve out his own reputation as the uncrowned champion of the division. And despite 5 separate attempts to make this fight a reality, everything from injuries and illnesses to the COVID-19 pandemic caused this fight to die a slow and painful death. With Khabib now obviously retired and Ferguson seemingly on the decline, I guess we'll never know how this fight would have played out. But for our money, no fight in UFC history has caused the MMA community so much collective anguish. Anderson Silva vs. George St Pierre. One of the major narratives that followed the longtime welterweight champion George St Pierre during his masterful reign atop the 170-pound weight class was the presence of a certain middleweight champion who seemingly had the style to cause him great trouble. Just 15 pounds separated 2 of the greatest fighters to ever set foot in the octagon. And though Anderson Silva frequently tested the waters at 205 pounds, it took George St Pierre until 2017 to emerge from his self-imposed hiatus and finally move up in weight. Both guys have their own compelling arguments for GOAT status, with GSP, the technician, proving himself to be a next-level caliber of athlete, wrestler, and overall strategist. Silva, though he was eventually found out, was St Pierre's complete opposite, a patient striker whose sniper-like precision and finishing instincts made him perhaps the single most exciting talent in the history of the sport. And while speculation over who would win in a Silva vs. GSP matchup was rampant, the pair unfortunately never did sign on the dotted line to fight. This one, in particular, is the type of what-if that keeps longtime MMA hardcores up at night, even to this day. Jon Jones vs. Anderson Silva. And finally, we come to the only fight that could beat out Silva vs. GSP for the top spot. As we mentioned before, Anderson Silva was never afraid to test himself at 205 pounds, finding great success with quick knockouts over the likes of James Irwin, Stephan Bonner, and Forrest Griffin. But even with his greatness as clear as day, he never truly made an attempt at adding the light heavyweight title to his collection. According to Silva himself, he never desired to fight the reigning champion, Jon Jones, who the Spider considered to be a good friend at the time. Naturally, the fans were disappointed as hell, questioning the truce that formed between these 2 all-time greats. Jones, though still young in his reign during Silva's prime, was seen by many as the most impressive fighter to ever fight in mixed martial arts. He was, and to this day is, the perfect physical specimen for this sport. And though on paper the stylistic matchup appears to favor Jones with his watertight skill set and overall physicality, Anderson brought to the table certain X factors that simply cannot be underestimated. Had both parties agreed to fight, and had the UFC in turn jumped on the opportunity to set it up, there is absolutely no doubt that it would have easily been both the biggest fight in MMA history and one of the most competitively significant combat sports showdowns of all time.